restless.
We're back, and it's the meat in our Lord of the Rings sandwich, the Two Towers. So, with absolutely zero ado and no restraint on spoilers, it's time to ask, what's the difference? When last we left our trilogy, Part 1, The Fellowship of the Ring, was a fast-forwarded exercise in urgency. The film adaptation, while mostly straightforward, took all of the furry, tough-hided hobbit feet-dragging from the novel right out, opting instead for what seemed like an exhausting sprint across Middle-earth over the course of a few weeks.
But that is much less the case with Tolkien's second installment, The Two Towers. The structure of these stories are crazy different. Most obviously, the first half of the book tells the story of Aragorn, Gimli, Legolas, and friends from start to finish, then backtracks to follow Frodo, Sam, and Gollum in the second half.
The movie, on the other hand, cuts back and forth telling both halves of the narrative concurrently. So, while these separate adventures take the same amount of time to unfold, Tolkien doesn't mess around with cross-cutting. And because the narrative structure is so different, the ripple effects of any given change become difficult to track chronologically. So, this episode of What's the Difference will have a bit of a different structure too.
And full disclosure, we thought about doing this with graphs and charts and an easel, but well, we just didn't want to. So, here we go.
Let's start by grouping three characters together, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. In the movie, they've been hot on the trail of the orcs who kidnapped Merry and Pippin for 3 days and nights, much to the dwarf's chagrin.
Keep breathing. That's the key. Breathe.
The book opens with the Fellowship scattered and Aragorn racing to answer the call of Boromir's horn. However, he's too late to help because Boromir is already riddled with arrows. He apologizes for trying to steal the ring from Frodo and for not protecting Merry and Pippin from the band of orcs before dying in Aragorn's arms. And after packing Boromir up in a boat all ceremonial-like, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas float him over a waterfall before they take off orc hunting and hobbit rescuing.
All of that stuff happens exactly the same way in the movie, just not this movie. As we pointed out in the last episode, all of it takes place at the end of the Fellowship of the Ring. So, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, collectively known as AGL from now on, hustle across the plains, hunting the Uruk-hai until they run into Éomer, a marshal of the Riddermark, and his horsemen. The group throws some shade back and forth.
I would cut off your head, dwarf, if it stood but a little higher from the ground.
But ultimately, they get on the same page about how dead the orcs are and how probably dead the Merry and Pippin are.
The one big difference is kind of a carryover from the first book. At this meeting, Éomer is in awe of Aragorn because of his sword, the elvish blade reforged that proves Aragorn is of kingly descent, making him a legend more than a man in Éomer's eyes. Either way, the shade throwing is basically the same in the book and movie.
But we have to rewind a little on Éomer. At this point, movie Éomer has been banished by the obviously evil Grima Wormtongue. I mean, the dude's name is Wormtongue and he looks like this. Could not be more obvious. Book Éomer, while no longer in the favor of the king thanks to Wormtongue's treachery, has not at this point been banished. So, being out on the plains hunting orcs is still technically his job.
From their conversation with Éomer, AGL moves on to the smoldering pile of orcs. The discovery of Merry and Pippin's escape is dealt with in a roughly similar non-linear fashion in both the book and the movie, with Aragorn tracing the steps of the hobbits into Fangorn Forest. In the book, however, AGL camps out on the edge of the forest for a night, where they briefly see a spectral old man in white, just kinda hanging out and watching them. Is it Saruman? Is it Gandalf? Kinda spooky, right? So the next morning they head into Fangorn where they encounter the old man in white again to find out, yay, it's Gandalf back from the dead.
In the book and movie, Gandalf explains how he defeated the Balrog and his subsequent journey through space and time to rejoin his companions on Middle-earth. Then, all four of them, AGL-G now, I guess, head swiftly to Edoras and the Hall of Theoden, King of Rohan, where they find Theoden under Saruman's spell, closely guarded by obvious bad guy Grima Wormtongue.
Book Theoden, however, is being controlled by Grima himself using, quote, subtle poisons. As opposed to the movie where Gandalf draws Saruman out as poison from a wound, Book Gandalf simply tells Grima to cut it out. Grima doesn't get sent away like he does in the movie. Instead, he's offered the chance to ride to war with the rest of Rohan, but surprise, surprise, evil McBad Dude guy chooses to take off in fear. Meanwhile, Éomer, who again in the book has not been banished, comes back home to Edoras, happy to see Grima running away.
At this point in the movie, Gandalf debriefs Theoden on all the bad news in Middle-earth, and Theoden decides to march all of his people to the refuge of Helm's Deep, where he knows they can defend themselves. But Gandalf knows they'll need reinforcements, so he takes off hoping to find Éomer, who, again, in the movie, has been banished.
Book Theoden, like as soon as he wakes up, decides it's time to muster the Rohirrim and go join the forces that are already battling Isengard to kick Saruman's ass. Literally, he says, let's have some lunch, and then let's go do this thing right now. He leaves the city defenseless and Éowyn, his niece and Éomer's sister, in charge.
Let's rewind just a little bit on Éowyn now. In the movie, we first meet Éowyn as her cousin, the king's son, is dying from his wounds fighting the orcs of Isengard. Then Grima hits on her using Middle-earth's version of negging.
Like a morning of pale spring, still clinging to winter's chill.
This thread of Grima wants Éowyn real bad is in the book, but only very briefly. The film expands on it, making her a character strong in her desire to contribute, but painted into a corner by her gender in the male-dominated world around her.
You've some skill with a blade.
In the book, she's just said to be pretty and that people seem to like her. Then her uncle leaves her in charge, and that's literally it for her in the Two Towers. Again, we're reading these as we go here, so if that changes in Return of the King, keep it to yourselves.
Fast forwarding back to the march away from Edoras, in the movie it's a slow-moving column of retreating civilians. Along the way, Aragorn talks to Arwen, his lady elf, in his dreams, and in another memory thinks about her difficult decision between leaving with her people or staying with a mortal man in Middle-earth. This scene by itself is more than she appears in the book, but for the movie it further develops the love between Aragorn and Arwen while reminding us that Aragorn and Éowyn probably ain't gonna happen.
In the book, they march away from Edoras in a spirited march to war. AGLG is still a four-man band, and everybody seems pretty stoked about battling Saruman. Until a rider coming back from Isengard tells them the orcs of Isengard are too many, and it is in fact the Rohan side getting their ass kicked. This is the point where the army decides to ride to Helm's Deep, but just the army, not the inhabitants of Edoras. This is also about the time when Gandalf takes off unexpectedly and without explanation. The dude just goes saying, "I'll be back later," and then the rest of the men, AGL included, make it the rest of the way to Helm's Deep, no problem.
In the movie, a group of warg riders attack the caravan en route to Helm's Deep, making the situation of the people of Rohan even more desperate. But it also sends Aragorn over a freaking cliff, and since we've already seen movie Aragorn communicate with Arwen via dreams, she's able to find him and send a horse to pick him up. So it's Aragorn that sees the giant army of orcs headed to Helm's Deep that warns Theoden, as opposed to the soldier that turned the riders away from their course to Isengard in the book.
Once at Helm's Deep, the actual battles are both very similar, save for two glaring differences. 1. No elves show up to help. Once Theoden and the rest of his men of Rohan are in Helm's Deep, it's just them fighting off the orcs. And 2. When Gandalf shows up with reinforcements, it's not with Éomer and his Rohirrim, because remember, Éomer's been back with Theoden for a while in the book. Instead, Gandalf has Erkenbrand in tow, a semi-retired soldier of Rohan who is part of the forces that were getting their asses kicked by Isengard, along with as many men as Gandalf could track down.
He's also got a bunch of trees. Just a big spooky forest pops up outside Helm's Deep out of nowhere and sort of eats all of the orcs. Gandalf doesn't even know where it came from. But aside from super rad shield surfing elf action, which frankly would have been hard to imagine in Tolkien's day, the actual fighting part of the battle plays out much the same in the book and the movie. And this is where AGL's part of the story ends in the movie. Gandalf has returned, the orcs have been defeated, and they all look out to the east super majestically.
All our hopes now lie with two little hobbits.
But the book keeps going. In fact, the rest of AGL's side of the story in the Two Towers book takes you through like the first 30 minutes of the Return of the King movie. So we'll get to that in our next episode, because now we have to rewind to cover Merry, Pippin, and the Ents. Okay, where's the rewind button? There we go. Rewind.
Refresh.
They are not for eating.
Okay, way back at the beginning of the Two Towers, when still held captive by the orcs, in both the book and movie, Merry and Pippin escape when Éomer and his men attack the orcs.
In the movie, Merry and Pippin take off into the forest where Treebeard the Ent stomps on their orc pursuer and takes the hobbits straight to the White Wizard, who we are meant to think is the villainous Saruman. For the movie's purposes, this replaces the "is it Saruman, is it Gandalf, kind of spooky, right?" moment that AGL had seeing the spectral old man on the edge of the forest the night before. So while both the book and the movie each feature tension surrounding the identity of this mysterious white wizard, it took 2 changes to the book to keep it for the movie.
Gandalf. I am Gandalf the White.
In the book, however, the hobbits escape from the orc on their own, and it isn't until a bit later that they are found by Treebeard and never run into a white wizard, Gandalf or otherwise. They spend a great deal of time with the Ent, even crashing at his place for a night. And unlike the movie, there's no confusion on the part of the Ents as to Merry and Pippin's identity.
We're not orcs. We're hobbits.
Hobbits. Never heard of a hobbit before.
The Ents do meet in a conclave that takes 2 full days, and by the end, they've easily decided that Saruman has turned evil and something must be done about him.
In the movie, the Ents instead decide to do nothing, opting to stay out of the affairs of Middle-earth the way they always have. It isn't until Pippin tricks Treebeard into walking past Isengard to see the destruction Saruman has wrought there firsthand that Treebeard and the rest of the Ents are roused sufficiently to go to war.
In the book, these events are not described in real time, but instead recounted by Merry and Pippin when they're reunited with AGLG in the flooded ruins of Isengard. But again, that's second book stuff that wound up in the third movie.
And now we're like 10 minutes into this episode about the Lord of the Rings, and we haven't even mentioned the ring yet. So let's rewind and start this thing over with Frodo, Sam, and Gollum. We first find Frodo and Sam lost on a foggy, smelly mountain, and as they wander, they gradually become aware that Gollum is now tailing them from a shorter distance.
And remember, this is the beginning of the second half of the book, picking up 3 days after the Fellowship has disbanded, roughly the same time AGL is sprinting across Rohan chasing Orc. In the movie, they lay in wait for him and pounce when he gets too close. And in the book, Gollum falls from a rope while climbing down a cliff and Frodo and Sam hop on him that way. But the taming of Smeagol is largely the same in both versions. They have a little knockdown, drag out with him, tie him up with the Elvish rope, but as it turns out,
Burns! It burns us!
and it all ends with Gollum agreeing to guide them to Mordor.
The first stop along the way is the Dead Marshes, a creepy swamp full of dead bodies that beckon the travelers into the water. Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, or FSG from now on for brevity's sake, make it through the Dead Marshes in basically the same way in the book and the movie, including an encounter with a Nazgul. The only real difference is book Frodo doesn't fall into the water like his movie counterpart.
Also in both the book and movie, FSG gets to the Black Gate of Mordor only to have Gollum talk them out of heading into the Blacklands that way. Then, after a debate with himself, Smeagol decides to ditch Gollum for a while, and they even cook up a brace o' conies together.
What's it doing? Stupid fat hobbit.
Everything happens in basically the same way up until they run into Faramir, Boromir's brother and captain of Gondor.
In the movie, FSG stands by and watches Faramir's men attack a bunch of Southrons on Oliphants. Gollum sneaks off, but Frodo and Sam get bound and taken hostage. In the book, though, Faramir is a much nicer guy. They run into each other before the attack on the Southrons, and Faramir is nothing but cordial.
Frodo and Sam are taken back to Faramir's cave, where a long and respectful discussion takes place over food and wine. Faramir is even courteous to Smeagol after finding him in the Forbidden Pool. The biggest difference in the book and movie, though, is that book Faramir is never seduced by the ring. He discovers Frodo is indeed carrying the One Ring, but understands the ring's deceitfulness and lets FSG go with only a warning to Frodo that Gollum does not seem a trustworthy guy.
Movie Faramir, much like his older brother, desires to keep the ring for Gondor and decides to bring the hobbits with him to Osgiliath. And so, FSG remain Faramir's captives for the rest of the movie. Faramir is not moved to release FSG until he sees Frodo in the presence of a Nazgul and begins to understand the burden he truly bears.
FSG's half of the book, much like AGL's, takes the hobbits much farther into their story. In fact, as of the last pages of The Two Towers, Frodo has been stung by the giant spider and his seemingly lifeless corpse captured by orcs, a point to which their movie counterparts don't arrive until more than 2 hours into The Return of the King.
At the end of all this, a few things become clear about the Two Towers. One is that the two halves of the tale, AGLs and FSGs, have literally nothing to do with the other. For Tolkien, it may have just been easier to tell the tales separately, and for Peter Jackson, the modern language of cinema demands the stories be intercut. But the challenge of lining up the halves of the Two Towers chronologically is that they just kinda don't.
So you wind up with things like Faramir dragging FSG to Osgiliath to kill a little time so AGL's story can keep up. And you wind up with an episode of What's the Difference that talks about stuff from one book that's in a different movie, which is kind of a drag.
But hey, guess what? We'll be back next month with The Return of the King. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe to CineFix so you don't miss the epic conclusion of the epic adaptations of JRR Tolkien's epic fantasies right here on What's the Epic? What's the Difference?
What's happening out there?
Shall I describe it to you? Or would you like me to find you a box?